How's it going, everyone? This video is going to be about the United States midterm elections, how they are run, what they mean, the strategy behind it, and the math behind it. Okay, so first off, the midterm elections are not the presidential elections. Okay, the president is still the president. The presidential elections happen every 4 years, whereas elections for Congress in the United States happen every 2 years. Okay, the year that there's a presidential election and 2 years after that, or 2 years before that as well. And so in the United States Congress, it's like America's version of a parliament, but it's not the same thing as a parliament. So I'm going to go through that, the difference, and what that all means. Okay, so first off, there's two houses of Congress in the United States. Okay, there's the lower house, which is often just called the House. Okay, and there's the upper house of Congress, which is called the Senate. Okay, now the Senate is not the same as the Canadian Senate. It's not the same as the House of Lords in the UK. In the United States, the Senate is also elected. And pretty much all of the senators, with rare exception, are from one of the mainstream political parties, the mainstream right-wing party, Republicans, or the mainstream left-wing party, the Democrats. So the Senate really is like an upper house of elected parliament. Now, there's some significant differences between the two. Okay, so first off, in the Senate, okay, and here we have a map of recent election results. So in the Senate, every single state has 2 senators. Okay, so it doesn't matter, big state, small state, high population, low population. Every state has equal representation. Okay, 2 senators per state. That's the upper house of Congress. In the House, okay, the states with a higher population have more seats. The states with a lower population have less seats. So the House in the United States, this is what's most analogous to Parliament in Canada, for example. Okay, places where there's a higher population, those places have more representation, more seats. Places with a lower population have less representation, less seats. Now there's another difference, which is that the House representatives are elected every 2 years. All of them are elected every 2 years, and they're elected for 2 years. In the Senate, senators are elected for 6 years, but elections still happen every 2 years. Okay, but those elections, when they happen, they're not for the entire Senate, but only for approximately 1/3 of it. Okay, so for example, in these most recent elections, 35 of the 100 seats, right, because there's 50 states, 2 senators per state, so 100 seats. 35, approximately 1/3 of those 100 were being contested in this election. Okay, so here's a timeline, roughly, of how something like that would work. Okay, so let's say we have 2016, 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2024. Okay, so in 2016, you have the presidential election, and that happens every 4 years, right? You have elections for the entire House, and you have elections for 1/3 of the Senate. Okay, so for the Senate, we're going to put that the first third of the Senate. Okay, then what happens in 2018? Okay, well, there's no presidential election because that happens only every 4 years. There's still elections in the House, and there's elections for the second third of the Senate. Okay, and then what happens in 2020? Well, you have a presidential election because it's been 4 years now, right? You have elections for the entire House, and then you have elections for the third third of the Senate. Okay, so now from 2016 to 2020, okay, you've had elections for every part of the Senate, the first third, the second third, the third third. What happens in 2022? Okay, well, there's no presidential election. The entire House gets reelected, and you're electing that first third of the Senate again. Okay, so those who were elected in 2016, They've now served their 6 years, okay, and now they stand for election again, right? So what happens then is between presidential elections, right, because this is 4 years between presidential elections, you have elections that are not the presidential elections. So they're called midterm elections, okay? They're in the middle of a presidential term, midterm elections. But what's actually happening there is something that happens every 2 years, which is the entire House gets elected and approximately one third of the Senate gets elected, okay? Now, this creates some interesting dynamics, okay? So first of all is that 2/3 of the Senate, anytime there's an election, 2/3 of the Senate is not getting elected. Okay, 2/3 of the Senate is not worrying about getting elected. So they don't have to worry about an election campaign or anything like that, and they can just continue doing government work. And, well, that's generally considered a good thing, right? You don't have the entire government worrying about elections, or the entire elected part of the government worrying about elections all at the same time. You do have 2/3 of the Senate doesn't have to focus on elections whenever elections are going on. They can focus on that work. Okay, this is one of the criticisms sometimes said about a democratic system is that, well, you have people in government worrying about getting reelected instead of doing work that government needs to do. So first of all, you can set up a democratic system so that a large portion of the elected part of the government actually doesn't have to worry about getting elected when elections are going on by having it staggered like this. And the other explanation is that in every single political system, the government has to spend resources and time on maintaining power. And the question is, how do they spend that resources and time? Okay, in the democratic system, they have to worry about election campaigns. In other political systems, they have to worry about other ways of maintaining power, but they still have to spend time and resources on it. So this isn't something unique to a democratic system. But in any case, there are ways of mitigating for it by, for example, having only 1/3 of the Senate elected at a time, so 2/3 of it are not worrying about campaigning anytime that there's an election. Another interesting dynamic that it creates is if you're a senator, you're elected for 6 years, okay? So to convince people who vote for you that you need to be reelected, well, you've got 6 years to do that. You've got 6 years to demonstrate what you're capable of, okay? Whereas the House, the entire House, okay, is elected every 2 years, right? So if you're elected into the House, you want to get reelected, you've got only 2 years to show what you can do. So as a result, people elected in the House are more likely to focus on short-term problems, right? Problems that can be solved or issues that can be resolved within 2 years. Whereas if you're in the Senate, you can actually focus more on long-term problems, okay? Because you've got an entire 6 years to demonstrate that you are worth voting for again. Okay, so you have a part of the government that can focus on long-term issues, and you've got a part of the government that can focus on, or that must focus on, short-term issues. And then you have the president, which is somewhere in between, right? Because the president gets reelected every 4 years. And so this creates an interesting dynamic and interesting motivators, right? So sometimes in this channel, I'll talk about sports, games, and different strategies and game design. And there's explicit motivations, explicit dynamics, and then there's implicit or indirect motivations and dynamics, right? So for example, in soccer, you can't touch the ball with your hands, right? Very rarely do people touch the ball with their hands. Why? Because there's a rule that says that you can't, right? So there's an explicit motivation there not to touch the ball with your hands. What also happens in soccer, a lot of the time people hit the ball with their head. There's no rule that says you have to do that, okay? But people do that as a result of the other rule, which is, well, you can't touch it with your hands, so how are you going to reach it if it's high up? Well, so you have to reach it with your head, okay? So that's a dynamic that comes from an indirect motivation, right? So an implicit motivator. So there's no rule that says senators have to focus on long-term problems and and representatives in the House have to focus on short-term problems. There's no rule like that, but because of how elections are run, that's a common dynamic that occurs. And what's also interesting is, so in the House, right, there's more representation for states with a higher population, right? So if you look here, this is a map of the United States, and you look at the borders of what seats in the House represent what regions, right? And larger states, let me just make this bigger, right? So larger states, if you look at Texas right here, if you look at California, right, Florida, they're separated into many sections, right? There's lots of seats for those larger states, states with higher populations. States with lower populations, not so many seats, right? If we go to Bloomberg here, right, they actually have a kind of a map of the United States where there's little squares representing seats, right? So look at all these seats for California, for Texas, for Florida, lots of them. Whereas smaller states, right, like you have Nebraska, Arkansas, right, Alaska, Hawaii, lower population, low seats, right? So you have more representation for states with a higher population, but remember the House seats, the people, these representatives, they have to worry about shorter term problems. So they're representing a smaller group of people, a smaller region, and they're focusing on more short-term problems. Whereas in the Senate, the senators are focused more on long-term issues, and each senator is representing an entire state, right? So a large territory and a larger group of people, and they're focusing on more long-term issues. Okay, so that creates an interesting dynamic as well. And also for those long-term issues, every state has equal representation. For the more short-term issues, states with higher population have more representation. That is an interesting dynamic as well. So now since we're already here, okay, let's look a little bit at the results. Okay, the final results are not in yet. Okay, there's still some states that are counting ballots. We have Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia is actually going to have another election between the two top leading candidates in December. So we don't know the final results for the Senate or the House yet, but there are certain predictions that were made and certain outcomes that already demonstrate some of those predictions. So first of all, what often happens in midterm elections, right? So these are the Congress elections that happen between presidential elections, not during presidential elections, is that it's been 2 years since the president was elected, and it's pretty often that people tend to shift their views against the political party of the president. Okay, now in the United States, unlike a parliamentary system, you can vote for a representative for your electoral district from one party and vote for a president for a different party. Okay, you can vote for a senator from one party and a representative in the House from another party, and if it's a year of a presidential election, you could also vote for the president of whatever party you want, right? You don't have to vote. Like it's not like one vote counts for both the head of state and the representative of parliament. You could vote for different parties in that regard. Same with the two different houses of Congress, right? Senator from one party and representative in the House from another. So it's been 2 years since the president was elected. So the president has had 2 years to not hold promises that he made, to do things that president said he wouldn't do, right? So typically people shift their opinion against the political party of the president over those 2 years, right? Honeymoon period ends, and so that's shown in the midterm election. So it was predicted, right now the president is from the Democratic Party, and the prediction was that, well, okay, there's going to be a shift in the House, in the Senate, towards the Republican Party. And so for the House, that's actually what we see. Okay, so the entire House is reelected. All right, you need 218 seats to get majority in the House. Okay, and that's because, let me just go back here. The House has 435 seats. Okay, so with 435 seats, 218 is going to give you majority. Okay, and before these elections, the Democratic Party had a slight majority. Results aren't in, but it looks like Republicans are on their way to a slight majority now. And it was expected that Republicans would likely take control of the House. That's what's happening. For the Senate, it's a bit of a different story, right? So remember, it's not the entire Senate that's getting elected, but only 1/3, which means 2/3 of it is not getting elected. Okay, and from those 2/3, okay, 36 seats that are not on the ballot are Democrat seats, and only 29 seats that are not on the ballot are Republican seats. Okay, so Republicans have a longer way to get to 50, right? They have to get from 29 to 50, right? Whereas Democrats only have to get from 36 to 50, okay? And before, the Senate was split exactly 50-50, which actually meant the Democrats control it, because if a vote goes perfectly 50-50 in the Senate, the tiebreaker is the vice president, who is right now a Democrat. So 50-50 means the Democrats control it, and the Democrats did control it, right? And now you have this election, right? So in this election, right, Republicans 50 minus 29, that's 21. So Republicans, they have to defend 21 seats and then win another one to get control. Whereas Democrats, right, they already have 36, right? So they only have to defend 14 seats, and that's it. They don't have to win anything on top of that, right? So as the elections start, Republicans actually have a disadvantage. They have more seats to defend. They have less opportunities to win a seat, whereas Democrats have less seats to defend and more opportunities to win a seat. So on one hand, there's this expectation that public opinion shifts against the Democrats, against the party of the president. But on the other hand, there's more Republican seats in play, less Democrat seats in play, which gives the Democrats an advantage. Okay, so it's like your net is, if you're the Republicans, right, your net is bigger and you're a goal behind, right? If you're a Democrats, you're a goal ahead and you've got a smaller net, right? The opponent has a bigger net. So with that kind of dynamic, it still looks like it's going to be pretty close to 50-50. And again, results aren't even in yet, final, right? There's still some states that are counting. Georgia's going to have another election later on. So Republicans might still even gain control. They might even become one seat ahead. Who knows? So considering the starting locations with the Democrats being ahead, the fact that it's pretty close to 50-50 actually does show that Republicans did quite well, which is congruent with this expectation that opinion tends to shift against the party of the president during midterm elections. And that's that. So that's how midterm elections work, what they are, the math behind it, what's happened so far, and what to expect. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time.